Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Today is the 25th of January, 2023, and this is our employment, HR and health and safety update. Just in terms of timings, we'll finish the presentation at around 11:30, maybe a little bit sooner if possible. We'll have a break at 10:30, just a quick comfort break, 5-10 minutes. And the first section of the presentation today, as you probably saw from the invite, is in relation to the metaverse. And the speakers on that initially will be Helena Newbury, one of our employee relations advisors from our people projects team, talking about artificial intelligence in recruitment and retention. Chris Hayes, our senior associate lawyer, will then be talking about employment law in the metaverse. And then Neil Hughes Hutchins, who's head of our health and safety team, will be talking about the pros and cons of virtual reality in health and safety training. We'll then have the break, and then we'll go into the employment law update. Anthony Fox, associate solicitor, will be dealing with the case update and things on the horizon in terms of legislation. And then we'll go back to Neil, who'll then talk about some news and information and update in terms of health and safety. So just kicking off then, I guess, with the metaverse and the reason really for focusing on this. We did a Q&A session a couple of weeks ago now on the metaverse. We are seeing more questions on the metaverse and issues around artificial intelligence and effectively the technology associated with the metaverse. And there's research by Microsoft, which you may have seen last year, which said that 50% of Gen Z and millennial employees envisage doing some of their work on the metaverse in the next 2 years. So that obviously has prompted discussions with employers and clients calling us in terms of what issues does that raise, what matters arise as a result of that. Are there things in relation to artificial intelligence, discrimination, inequality in terms of access to technology, confidentiality? And one of the biggest issues has been the issue with people having different virtual people who represent themselves, avatars, as they're called. Loads of issues which effectively arise during day-to-day employment that can also arise with an avatar as well. So it's all interesting stuff. So we thought we'd deal with that first and try and dig into some of the issues at a reasonably high level. And so with that, I'll hand over to Helena, who's going to look at AI in recruitment and retention.
Morning, everyone. It's lovely to have you here on this lovely, drizzly Wednesday morning. So as Chris mentioned, I'm one of the employee relations advisors in the people projects team, and I'm just going to be talking a little bit on artificial intelligence in recruitment and retention and how that generally works. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to start off with, what even is artificial intelligence or AI in the context of HR? Because when you first start thinking about it, if you're anything like me, I sort of thought that it was robots and something of the future that is nowhere near anytime soon. But obviously that is no longer the case. When you think about it, you need to think about things like Alexa or Siri or Tesla if you're lucky enough to have a Tesla car. So it's no longer a thing of the past, and it's now being used in HR more frequently. And as we know, with anything like technology based, year on year, the developments are absolutely massive. So it's already being used in areas of HR to alleviate HR of repetitive or time-consuming tasks, such as in recruitment, where you can use it for things like searching through CVs. You can use it for employee engagement, doing engagement surveys, and to find out about ask specific targeted questions for employees. You can use it for psychometric testing, and a lot of household names such as Facebook, Amazon, Unilever have already started implementing those bigger organisations. Unilever actually reported in 2019 the use of their AI in recruitment had saved approximately 100,000 hours in interviewing time, which approximately for them was £1 million per year. So at the moment, whilst we are seeing it with those bigger companies that can afford to develop and introduce that kind of software, it is being slowly drip-fed into smaller organisations. Next slide, please. So how does that work with recruitment then? So there was a study done by Click Onboarding that states that employees have a much higher probability of staying with a company if they experience superior onboarding. So it's vital that companies look at their recruitment and onboarding processes to improve employee retention, especially as we've seen in the recent years, issues with, and I non-stop go on about it, but the Great Resignation that everyone has faced with, and also just difficulties recruiting in these times. So apparently the average new hire has 54 activities to complete during the onboard period. So that can be things like sending in right to work documents, signing contracts, understanding those policies. So the use of AI to do those 54 activities will have brilliant advantages to the company and to the employee, so that they don't have to ask a person a question that might be really straightforward, and they might just be thinking about it whilst they're at home the night before they start a new role. So it's clear to see what the benefits of using something such as that would be for both the pre-boarding and the onboarding of new employees. AI could also have the benefit in that process of improving diversity in the workplace by not only removing elements of unconscious bias from recruitment, so managers where they may have biases that they may not be aware of in areas such as recruitment and shortlisting, but could also help, for example, make reasonable adjustments for interview processes such as virtual interviews, where the software can introduce closed captioning in videos as a reasonable adjustment. With that, then actually does there are some drawbacks with AI. I'm sure if anyone on here has looked into AI, or even I think it comes up on Facebook quite a bit, that there are quite a few high profile drawbacks, as it does have the unintended consequences of encoding the status quo with when building the AI software. So it's a bit of a basic level for someone who isn't technological, as I am not, in terms of how they build this software. They'll input all of their previous recruitment processes, so previous interview notes, interview tests, CVs, all of that into the system, which will then generate a code for what the employee or what the company is looking for in their future employees. So that is where Facebook, the most high profile example of where their AI practices went wrong, they built a recruitment service or recruitment AI system, which then was more likely to hire a man over a woman because all of that historic bias, so all of that previous interview notes and interview tests meant that they were more likely to hire a woman moving forward. Facebook, even though they fixed those issues, they had to scrap their whole project because of the negative associations with that. Next slide, please. So the pitfalls. So as I mentioned, in terms of the risks of encoding that status quo, there would be the risk with that. There's also it lacks empathy, because AI can only be programmed with one goal in mind. So, for example, if you were to build an AI system that was purely to buy or sell stocks, it will only be able to reach a goal of making profit. It wouldn't be able to do anything else. So that is where it really lacks empathy, and as something as personal as HR and dealing with people and employees, to lack empathy is clearly a massive downside with that system. There's naturally, with anything that's increasing technology, there's also increased risks of cybersecurity issues with the introduction of AI. On the flip side of that, though, because it is technology, there are systems that can be used to protect against increases in cybersecurity risks. And it's also the fact that certain decisions do require human involvement. So although we can build systems that will allow for making these decisions, they do require that human involvement in making that. And then finally, in terms of the downside, the one that we'll all be thinking of when we think about AI is just the sheer cost in doing so. At the moment, generally speaking, especially for recruitment systems, you're hearing mainly about those bigger companies that have got the resource and the data to even be able to build those systems. So it is slowly starting to trickle down into the small and medium-sized organisations, but that is at the moment one of the downsides. Next slide, please. So how at the moment could we work effectively and efficiently and collaborate with AI, especially in recruitment? So for starters, we can recognise the benefits without replacing the human element. So when considering using it for something like recruitment, this is the company's first possible impression and their first chance to make a long-lasting relationship with that individual who is hopefully going to be joining their company. We don't want to remove all of the human element in that, because that will have the opposite effect of what it's intended to. So with that in mind, we should consider overseeing the results of the AI. So if using it for something like a CV review, consider doing a physical review afterwards, so we can really ensure that it's giving the benefits that we're intended to. Consider what other elements you can use AI for before replacing part of the recruitment or HR function. So a client we were speaking with at our HR community mentioned that they are using it to write memos for staff members. So that's a really beneficial way of saving time for HR and managers without having that forward-facing impact. So the employees won't be aware that it's been AI that's generated that memo, but they have that peace of mind and that time saving with using that. Brilliant, thank you. Next slide, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Hayes, one of our senior associates. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the legal implications of the metaverse in employment law in particular. Next slide, please. So yeah, I think it's important to say probably at the outset that a lot of this is still unknown how this will play out in a legal sense. For anyone who's not convinced that this is going to happen, it's certainly looking likely it will happen very soon, as opposed to in years down the road. I think I've read somewhere recently that Microsoft Teams, which we all use almost daily now, they either have or they're imminently this year about to launch their sort of offering of having an avatar as opposed to just having a virtual meeting. I suppose if you don't know what an avatar is, then you might have seen it. It's a bit like an emoji on your phone. It's a bit like it's a digital representation of yourself. So I think that's really interesting, because if you look at the first couple of points here, what are the things that obviously Facebook or Meta, as they're now known, have really put all the chips in and betted heavily that this is the future. One of the key things is during pandemic, I think everyone got used to virtual meetings where we're all on Teams and Zooms. And one of the problems with that you often hear is it stifles, it's not conducive to collaboration. And that's one of the things I hear from clients all the time, that being in the office together is the only way to really collaborate. However, the conundrum is that people want to work at home now, and that's not going away. So I think this is maybe part of the solution that may help with increasing collaboration by way of using this metaverse. So, so one of the things that I think would potentially happen is things like team meetings, where rather than having them at the minute via Teams as a virtual meeting, you might have your avatar, you go into a virtual room. That room could be branded up as your company. You might know this, but companies are already buying space in the metaverse. People are buying property in the metaverse. So things like having your own work space and branded space, etc., is going to be a thing as well, I believe. Meeting clients and customers, yeah, I think that's definitely going to happen. I think the way that I sort of look at it, one thing that sort of fascinates me as just on a personal level is thinking about how will our customers and clients of 5 years time and 10 years time want to engage with this. And I think one thing, if I don't know how many of you might notice this, but I often offer people meetings in person via Teams or via telephone. And it's always fascinating that sometimes people will have a meeting via Teams and put their camera on. Other days, they just want to put their camera off or work via telephone. And I think that's because some days you maybe don't want to be on screen. And I think the metaverse offers a real interesting solution to that, where you're not actually yourself on screen at any time. So that'll be interesting how, you know, the next generation maybe embrace that, because I think the next generation less and less want their cameras on. A good example of that is my wife's a lecturer at University of Law for sort of mid-20s, early 20s students, and they just don't want to put their cameras on. So I think that generation's used to that now. So offer them a solution that they don't have to, you know, appear in person. They can go as a digital avatar, I think is going to be attractive. Recruitment side I think is really interesting. So Helena touched on that, and I think there already is a concept known as blind recruitment, which if you don't know what that is, the idea is you remove as many factors as possible to potentially discriminate against candidates. So there's concepts of that, but I think it's quite difficult. The idea of blind recruitment to remove discrimination and bias, I think, is probably going to be enhanced through the metaverse if clients wish to do so. So I suppose you could have things like nondescript avatars that may not demonstrate any things about the individual, any physical aspects. So I think that's interesting how it will work on a recruitment basis. I think one of the things that we're about to move on to with the next slide, one of the problems and fascinating things is how you will represent yourself in the digital world, because probably for the first time in history, you can sort of design yourself any way you want. And one thing that's interesting about that is, you know, everyone probably wants to portray a slightly better version of themselves in the metaverse. That might be, you want to be a bit taller, a bit slimmer, a bit whatever it may be. You might want to have tattoos. You might want to do all sorts of crazy things that the virtual world and the metaverse will allow you to do. That represents, if you're an employer, you know, lots and lots of problems. There's actually a fascinating study, and it's a term now from the virtual world. It's called the Proteus effect. So the Proteus effect is a thing whereby the person's behavior is changed and influenced significantly by the characteristics of their avatar. And I think that's really, really fascinating stuff. So if you've got you might be a shy person in real life, but you might have a super tall, super muscular, imposing avatar, and that's the personality you then bring to the virtual world. And that in itself represents some potential fascinating problems and issues for employers. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I think that leads us into thinking about misconduct and discrimination and behavior. A lot of these things sort of link in together, and I think the way to think about this, if you're an employer, is what happens if your digital employee, your avatar employee, steps out of line, does something wrong in the metaverse. So thinking some of these points through, again, we're sort of taking a best guess at the moment because none of us really know the answers. But we can take some examples. There's no case law, there's no known examples I'm aware of disciplinary, of unfair dismissal in the metaverse that I'm aware of yet. There's lots of examples of virtual issues via, behavior via Teams or Zoom, and I think we're going to take a lot of precedent from that, which is quite clear that if an employee is on work time in the metaverse, then they most definitely will be subject to disciplinary and potential dismissal for misconduct and behavior that's not acceptable within the metaverse. The dress code and appearance is interesting. So let's say you've got a bunch of employees. One thing that's potentially you could do is you could say, if you work for this company, when you're in the metaverse, you're going to wear a digitally branded t-shirt that says Napthins on it. And that's what everyone does because that's our brand. So anyone that comes across it knows it's us. That's something that might happen, and employers might want to do that. They might go the other way and say you can design your own avatar, or you can have a lot of input on your avatar. So I think dress code's interesting. So if you did it, say, within a policy, which I'll come on to at the end, but I think the answer to a lot of this is get thinking about policies now and updating them. If someone turns up in the metaverse not wearing your branded t-shirt, or wearing, perhaps even worse, an competitor's branded t-shirt, or even worse still, a overtly offensive branded t-shirt, or any dress or appearance that is clearly offensive and not appropriate in a professional way, what are you going to do? I think you're going to want to discipline them is the answer. So I think dress code and appearance will be interesting, and how we within reason try to monitor that. I think employers, that's going to be vastly different approach here. You're going to get probably some stricter employers, which might be the bigger corporates. I don't know. It might be old school, old fashioned viewed employers, although they might never make it onto the metaverse. But you might get people who have a quite strict view on your avatar needs to look like this, needs to be quite muted in its appearance, quite professional. You might get another company like a creative design agency or something that says, we want you to be yourself, so design it the way you want. I think then what that leads on to is probably discrimination. I think that's where it gets tricky, and this is where it gets really interesting from a legal point of view. It's a lot of what ifs here, but imagine it's me, for example, and I design my avatar as a female, and I'm not a female, but the client doesn't know that. Will that be allowed? Or let's say you have an employee who is pregnant, and they have their avatar that's not pregnant, and then they are potentially mistreated because of that pregnancy. If the employer doesn't necessarily know about that at that point, perhaps that's not the best example. Let's use disability. That's a better example. Let's say an employee has a disability, but is primarily an online worker, which we have now, so that they're at home almost all the time. The employer may not see them very regularly, if at all. They might see them once, and the manager might change. And let's say that employee has an obvious physical disability, but in the virtual world, in the metaverse, they don't present themselves that way because they don't want to. They present themselves as a person without a disability, and they're therefore treated that way. And then there's issues that may arise that ultimately the employer could fall foul of discrimination, or the other way around, where they might present themselves with a disability, or they present themselves with a protected characteristic. So another example would be, let's say, somebody who is quite gender fluid wants to represent themselves that day as a female, or a male dressed as a female. That's something they might want to do. It's entirely their own decision. And if that's allowed within the employer's guidelines, if that person is then discriminated against or harassed by another employee, they will have the absolute right to bring grievances about that and potential claims. Now, what's also fascinating about that is the concept of discrimination by perception. So I think that's something that we don't really come across a great deal in day-to-day employment law. Some of you might have heard of discrimination by association. Probably a good example of that is somebody who has caring responsibilities for an elderly person with a disability, and the person with caring responsibilities in the workplace is discriminated against because of that. They could potentially have a claim for discrimination by association because of their association with the disabled person. Like, discrimination by perception, I think, is going to be much bigger in the metaverse than it is in day-to-day life. So that is the concept whereby you can be discriminated against because someone perceives you to have a disability or perceives you to have a protected characteristic that you may not even have. So they might perceive you, for example, to be gay. They might perceive you to be lesbian. They might perceive you to be a race that you're not because of how you display yourself in the metaverse. And if they're offended by that and the conduct fits the definition of harassment, then there's a potential claim there for discrimination, even though that person in the real world may not actually have that characteristic. Now, that is proper make your head fall off stuff at the moment. If you start thinking deeply about that and all of the problems that could arise. But I think that probably leads me on to the next slide, actually, if we move on to that, just conscious of time. So yeah, some of the things I think to consider: protection of confidential company information. Absolutely. So I think when you're operating in the metaverse and your employees are, I think you've got to be very wary if you deal with clients like we do. You don't really know in the metaverse who's behind that avatar. So I think there will have to be some advancements. I'm sure the big, the metas of the world and Microsoft Teams will be on with this and how we do it. But I think from a company point of view, if you will be meeting clients, you will probably have to have some sort of checks in place to make sure that you're satisfied that that person is who they are. Because if you are in a private meeting or a team meeting and you might be sharing some information that's confidential, these things can be hacked. And I think you just need to be thinking about that. There's additional security steps. Company information, I think that's primarily about if you land onto a platform that perhaps you don't know and that's operating in the metaverse. So the likes of Teams and Zoom, we all know and probably trust. But if you go onto a platform that you're not aware of, I think you need to perhaps take a moment to think, is your information safe on there? Who owns that information? Does the platform have the right to access that? I think those things are all important to start thinking about. The working time side, a lot of people seem to get very concerned about this. I think it's quite similar to probably the world we live in now, which is we're online a lot. I think the working time bit is just being conscious that there'll still be working time regulations and obligations. And I think it will be thinking through setting boundaries about doing your work in the metaverse, if that's what you're going to be doing, and then having cut-off times to make sure that people aren't working all hours in the metaverse and you don't know much about that. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so this is my final slide. So I'm trying to pull that together for you. There are so many considerations at this point, but I think the answer, as is often the case in employment law and HR, the answer comes back to, I think, if you plan ahead, you will often be in a better position. So today, hopefully, you're being sort of forearmed and forewarned, and you can go from today and think about your policies, which would be the starting point. So I think you need to look at your relevant policies, which are up on the screen. So dress code policy, we talked about what on earth are you going to do about people designing their avatars. I think you're going to think about that. And if you have staff that are going to operate in this world, you might need to start thinking about how do we set these boundaries and what's right for your company. I repeat that because what's right for one company and their view on what an avatar should be and how muted or how self-reflective it should be is entirely different from person to person, business owner to business owner, different probably from sector to sector. I go back to the creative sector. I think they would be much more open to people just designing their avatar largely to the way they want to. I think disciplinary policies and procedures, you need to update those to reflect that actions in the metaverse virtual world will also potentially result in disciplinaries, etc. Equality and diversity, bullying and harassment, same thing. I think you've got to update those to reflect that they will also extend to this world. And, you know, as I said, this whole thing about perception and people being discriminated against or harassed, it doesn't have to require them being physically touched to be subject to harassment. It doesn't have to require them to have the protected characteristic that someone is accusing them of having. They're trying to discriminate them because of that. So it's fascinating stuff. I think you need to be looking at that. IT policies. Yeah, so I've made a little note on this one. I think the IT policy is really interesting because I think probably within that, if you're minded to try and have some say in how avatars will be presented in that world, I think your IT policy, you may be able to build into there some sort of rules and checks. And I'm just thinking out loud really here that if someone wants to change their avatar, same way some companies, if you want to change your sign off on your email, so if I wanted to change my sign off to, you know, senior partner of napkins, I probably can't do that. I have to go and get that checked with IT, because if everyone done that, it represents a risk to your business and could be misleading to your customers. I think you can maybe build something like that into your IT systems, where once your avatar is designed, maybe when people are onboarded, if you want to change that or update it, then absolutely you can, or you probably should be encouraged to, but via some sort of check with IT first. So there's a policy there and an opportunity for employers to sort of have stop any problems that might happen. I think IT policies also need to be updated to make clear that activity within that metaverse world during work time is able to be monitored. Because much like you can monitor emails now, you'll want to monitor some meetings, etc. So you can have the ability to look at that. Maximize security. Yeah, I think that's the point about if your staff are going on unknown third-party platforms to meet in the metaverse, be very careful of that. Probably check it first. Understand what it is, who owns the data, who owns the information when they're on there. And that links into the review of the terms and conditions. So if you don't know the platform, or even if you do know the platform, as a starting point, you might want to say, send us your updated terms, have a look at them, understand them, and then you can give the green light to your employees to use that platform for work-related meetings. And then the last thing is that link is worth probably having a look at if you're just at the beginning of your journey into the metaverse, which many of us are. I think that forum is to help start to talk about ethics and etiquette within the metaverse. I think it's maybe a good place to have a look if you just want to see what other people are doing or what guidance is and how to behave and how people will represent themselves. So yeah, that's it for me. It's really fascinating stuff. Don't get too scared about it. It's definitely coming. I think embrace it is the answer. Hopefully today gives you some thoughts. And yeah, if you need any help with things or want to talk it through more, you've got all the team here would be happy to do that. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. If anyone's got any questions, please put them in the chat box. We will have some questions at the end of this section as well, and I might have a couple for some of the speakers. But now we'll hand over to Neil to talk about virtual reality training, pros and cons, and then we'll have a quick break after that. Thanks, Neil.
Good morning, Neil Hughes Hutchings, Head of NAPTIMS Health and Safety here. I'm going to talk you through the pros and cons of virtual reality training. So if I could have the first slide, Caitlin, please. So whenever we talk about training, we see the term competence quite a lot. In legislation, in guidance, it says that people need to be competent to carry out their work activities or their tasks. And training is just one part to evidence competence. So competence is a combination of these four things that are on the slide. So it's a combination of the right training, having the correct knowledge, having the skills and the experience to carry out a task safely. So as I say, competence is a combination of all four of those aspects. If I could just have the next slide, please. So why is health and safety training important? So there are three key points here. Firstly, it helps people to learn how to do something. It informs people of what they should or should not do. And it also provides people with relevant information to be able to carry out a task or activity safely. On the next slide, I'm going to talk about the benefits of health and safety training. So if I can have the next slide. So by providing health and safety training, we can ensure people know how to work safely within your organisation. It can help to promote a positive safety culture by people in your organisation adopting safe working methods or safe working procedures. And it also allows you to meet your duties to protect the welfare, health and safety of your employees. And this is referenced in the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act of 1974. On to the next slide, please. The key thing about training is when I talk about training with clients and colleagues, some people always think that training has to be a certified or qualification course. This is not the case. It doesn't even have to always be classroom based. Think about how you train your staff in your organisation. It could be what we call on-the-job training. So it could be at a machine or a piece of equipment. And the supervisor could be training them at that piece of equipment. As I say, it doesn't always have to be classroom based, and it doesn't always have to have a certificate at the end of it. The key thing is that you record that you've trained your employees, but as I say, that doesn't have to be with a certified qualification. So on to the main part of the session on the next slide, please. We're going to look at the advantages of virtual reality training. Now, over my years in health and safety, I can see how virtual reality training has slowly developed. And I'm going to go back quite a few years ago when I did my driving test. I'm not going to say how many years ago that was. But back then when I did my driving test, there was this thing called a hazard perception test. And it was like a video that you watched and then you clicked on the screen where you thought there was a driving hazard or risk coming. So what that allowed me to do was to go into this completely virtual world whereby I was in a safe environment. I wasn't sat behind the wheel of the car, and I was sat in a classroom where I could safely identify hazards that I may face when I'm driving on the road. So that's kind of my first insight into virtual reality training all those years ago. So a benefit of it is that actual workplace environments can be created in that virtual world. And I just mentioned previously that it can allow a safe environment for your employees to practice their skills. If they're in a virtual environment and something goes wrong, the consequences are reasonably low compared to being in real life in the real world. And again, on many social media platforms now, they're trying to promote virtual reality health and safety training for high-risk situations. The one that I saw the other month was a working at height virtual reality training piece of software on a social media platform. And what that allowed workers to do was to go into that high-risk environment working at height. They could virtually clip self-arrest harness anchors onto different places. And as I say, if they were to get it wrong, the consequences were very low compared to if they got it wrong in the real world. Apologies for that. It can reduce travel costs as well. If you're in a virtual world, you don't have to go anywhere. You could do it from your own office, you could do it from your own home. So it could reduce the travel costs to go into training courses. It also allows people from different organisations to collaborate on a training course. So very similar to Teams or Zoom, you can get a number of people from different organisations and they can all sit through exactly the same training. It could also reduce the time taken to carry out the training. So you may find that the duration of the courses are a bit shorter, allowing more time for your employees to be productive and doing their normal jobs. The virtual world also allows people to repeat and practice their skills time and time again. You know, they can practice it in that virtual world until they get it right, until it embeds itself in their minds. So these are the benefits of virtual reality training. And going back to my driving test one, again, a few years ago, talking 5 to 8 years ago, perhaps, I did an e-learning course for fire extinguisher training. And again, it allowed me in the kind of a virtual world on screen to practice putting fires out with fire extinguishers, clicking on certain parts of the screen of where I would direct the hose of the fire extinguisher. So again, I can see how this has been developed. And if we take it to the modern day, I previously worked in construction, and there was a piece of kit that we had and some software that allowed a surveyor to go to any building site around the country. And it would take photos of every part of the building, and then using the software, it would stitch it all together, which would then allow a 3D walkthrough of that building. So we could be based in an office up here in the Northwest, and we could virtually walk through a building that was down south. And what that allowed my team to do, safety advisors could look at it from a fire risk assessor point of view, our quantity surveyors could look at it. So it was a real benefit to the organisation using this virtual reality software. If I could have the next slide, please. Obviously, on the flip side of that, there are always disadvantages. Virtual reality equipment at the moment is probably very expensive to purchase. So if you were looking at it for your company, the equipment is going to be reasonably expensive. On top of that, you may have to pay for the software as well that goes with the virtual reality equipment. Ironically, I guess the other flip side to it is that you're potentially putting goggles on people, which is going to restrict their line of sight. So you've then got the real risks of people colliding with each other in the virtual world. You've also got people bumping into the furniture in the room if you haven't planned the training room properly. And then you've got the associated possible eye strain and headache type injuries that we get from display screen equipment usage. You've then got the upkeep of the equipment. You know, if you're using it yourself or you're a training provider that provides virtual reality, you've got to make sure it's charged all the time. You've got to make sure it's free for damage and fit for use every time you use it. So it can create a burden on that. Obviously, the software might need updating. You know, if the software companies update their software, then you've got to obviously connect the device to your computer or Wi-Fi to update it. And you've got to keep it up to date with the most modern update for it. And then obviously there's the risk that your own equipment could actually get damaged during the course. You know, the delegate might damage it accidentally. So there's the cost of replacing equipment as and when it gets damaged. So these are just some of the disadvantages of the virtual reality training. And on my last slide, I'm just going to summarize. So in my mind, I can't see virtual reality training completely replacing health and safety training. I can see it supporting and benefiting it. For instance, we're an accredited IOSH training provider. We do that classroom-based, but I could see the benefits that virtual reality could provide, whereby there's a hazard spotting exercise or a risk assessment exercise. And if I could provide the delegates on that course with a virtual reality headset that sticks them in a safe environment for them to navigate their way around identifying hazards within the workplace, I can really see how virtual reality can benefit and support the classroom-based training as well. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand back to Chris Boyle to lead any questions from any of the participants watching this presentation.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, no, just picking up on some points. I mean, I think we have seen some really good examples of training in the metaverse and virtual training over the last 12 months, especially in things like equality and diversity inclusion. There's some really good examples of that alongside the health and safety training as well. And it's something that we're focusing on for clients cross sites. Certainly something to take into account. But just some questions that I've got. I don't think we've got any from the attendees. But Chris, I just want to come to you really first on the employment law side of things, because it's something that I know we've been asked about, and certainly we ponder, I guess, is that quite a lot of metaverse activity by its nature is done outside of 9 to 5 or what would amount to working hours. What's the position in terms of actions or potential misconduct that happens outside of normal working hours on in the metaverse? Is this something that, as employers, we're going to have to look, or we can potentially take action against employees for their actions of their avatars outside of working hours?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the short answer is yes. I think we will be able to do that. The reason why is we don't have direct examples at the minute that I'm aware of, but I think we can look to previous precedents, case law. It's quite well known, well established that if employees misbehave sort of on social media or that sort of virtual world, which is still outside of work, and they cause reputational harm or behave in a way that is completely unacceptable, not in line with your values, then yes, if they do that currently on social media, of course we can do stuff about that as employers. I think it'll be the same in the metaverse. So same principles would apply. I think it's about setting those boundaries about what's expected conduct. So it probably links back into your disciplinary policies there. Yeah.
Okay. And then just picking up on a point you mentioned, which I think maybe people may be interested in, is this protected characteristic and the avatar. You can see scenarios, I guess, where employers will, if this is used on a more regular basis, may start to want to dictate the type of avatar that's being used, or that the avatar itself mirrors what affect the ethnicity of the individual.
Yeah.
Is that problematic? Is that starting to dictate? You talked about dictating in terms of dress code, but in terms of the actual avatar itself, is that problematic?
Yeah, I think that's for me, when I think about this, it does fascinate me, all of this, as you know. I think that this is probably the big question that I'd be wrestling with if I was an employer. So, take me, for example, would I have to represent myself in the metaverse exactly sort of as I am in real life? Or could I represent myself entirely differently? I think if you're going to go down the route of, we want you to have a very close representation of yourself in the metaverse, which I think I say the big corporates, I might be wrong on that, but I imagine they probably will for consistency. I think if you do that, then you open yourself up, I think, some arguments about indirect discrimination there. So your policy might indirectly discriminate somebody with a protected characteristic, and they don't necessarily want to portray that in the virtual world because they don't want to. I think if you do enforce something like that, then you open yourself up to risk of those claims. But your defense for that as an employer is if you have objective justification for that and you think that through carefully, you might be able to make that happen and have a defense if those arguments were brought. I think thinking about objective justification, the one that springs to mind is probably to ensure the confidence of your clients, so clients know sort of who you are and who they're dealing with. That might be one of the justifications used. But yeah, I think that is the most tricky one at the minute in my mind. How hard do you push that line? You have to be exact reflection of yourself. I don't know. I think it will change vastly from company to company.
Yeah, I think it will. And I think you touched, there are some cases that are not specifically on the metaverse, but are in terms of social media, which could potentially be used in that sense. And then just the final point in connect, and this goes to one of Neil's points actually about the expense of equipment, but also the practicalities of individuals using headsets, VR goggles, etc. What is there's a possibility, in my view, that you can create a two-tier workforce here of people who are happy to use the metaverse, can use it adequately, can afford them, and then others that may not want to do that or may not want to use them. What are the risks there from an employment point of view? Because, you know, in other areas of employment law, we see two-tier workforce start to develop, and that has its own issues. Are the issues the same, or are they different?
Yeah, I think the possibility of creating two-tier workforces is highly likely. I think part of some of the problems that come to mind are if you've got employees that are maybe older in age and not perhaps as up to speed with technology or as willing to adopt new technology. You also will have some people with perhaps physical disabilities that will struggle with things like wearing headsets for long hours or just wearing headsets at all. And that might preclude those people from partaking in the metaverse. So I think as an employer, you do have to be thinking about that. I think if it's clear to you that you will require everybody to operate in some way in the metaverse, then if someone has a physical disability that precludes them from partaking, then I think you need to be, you know, understanding that now, see if you can help them overcome that, make reasonable adjustments if necessary. I think generally speaking, not just people who are older, because I know some clients of mine are tech whizzes and they're towards the back end of their careers. They're more technically advanced than I am, really. So I don't think I think that's a generalization, but I think upskilling and training will help massively across the board there. So if you are going to be expecting people to operate in the metaverse, I think you need to make sure that people are trained in how to get in there and how to log in, how to operate. And some people may require more training, and I think it's understanding that that's fine and allowing the time for that.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks, Chris. And then Helen, I just wanted to come to you on the AI recruitment point. I mean, I've read a lot around AI and recruitment in the last few months, and one of the issues with AI is, or one of the criticisms of AI is, by definition, it is the input, the learning is predominantly human information or data, which is machine learned. But that can cause some issues, as we've seen in the press, around discrimination occurring. So what practical recommendations would you make to client organizations who are thinking of using AI?
So at the moment, I'd definitely say that anything should have a human involved in it, so that the AI isn't the one making those decisions. So if the line managers who are going to be using this software first get training on how to do recruitment just as it stands now, so that way they themselves would be able to pick up on any biases of the machine, but then also providing them that training that they might need to work the AI, as Chris said, with the metaverse, making sure that everyone is effectively trained on that. And then as well, just accepting feedback. It does make you wonder if some of these bigger organizations like Facebook, when they had the issues with their AI softwares, if they were properly stress tested and if feedback was accepted to stop that from happening in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess this kind of issue of unconscious bias in recruitment can, in an odd way, be exacerbated by the use of AI if it's not, as you say, stress tested. So I think that's interesting. But I know a lot of organizations, as you say, are looking at the use of it in the initial stages. And then just to Neil, and then we'll have a quick break. Neil, in terms of some of the health and safety issues with this, I mean, when I'm logging on to Metaverse on a Saturday afternoon, I do often crash into the sofa when I'm playing cricket on the Metaverse. But one of the other side effects is it can give you a headache and a migraine and various other issues. So what's your advice on that in terms of health and safety? To mitigate against these, certainly the kind of, I suppose, dizziness and nausea that might come with VR headsets.
Sure. Thanks for the question there, Chris. As with anything within health and safety, a competent person should carry out a risk assessment for the work activity and then record the significant findings. So I've seen some research papers where there is this new term called cyber sickness, and that's what Chris is talking about there. So it's kind of the nausea, the dizziness, the disorientation that virtual reality headsets might pose to some people that use it. In addition, you've potentially got a small computer screen very close to your eyes. So there's the migraines, the headaches, and the eye strain risks as well. So in legislation, we've got clear legislation for what we call display screen equipment, or DSE. You may know the acronym. And that's kind of your computer equipment, your TV screens that your workers may use. So in that legislation, and when you're carrying out your DSE risk assessments and training your staff in it, you normally recommend that they should take a regular break throughout their usage of using that screen. So typically, if you were using a computer, you'd probably have a 5 to 10 minute break every hour, typically away from the screen. The same would go for virtual reality training, but you may limit it. So you may say that users can only use a virtual reality headset for 20 minutes, half an hour at a go, and then there's a 5 to 10 minute break before the next module or the next part of the training. Our aim there is to reduce the chance of the nausea, the dizziness, and it won't affect everyone. It probably won't affect anyone, so it may only affect a few people. The other thing that you've got to consider is the software that the virtual reality headset's using as well. Under the DSE regulations, you've got to make sure that your software that you're using is suitable. So if you're using a virtual reality software where there's lots of movements involved, so you're running through a virtual world, or like Chris said, playing cricket, there's going to be a lot of movement, and that can disorientate people. It may bring the nausea effect on more quickly. So do consider the software as well that you may be using. And just make sure that the software is really suitable and appropriate for the training that you're wishing to provide through that virtual reality headset. I kind of hope that's answered your question there, Chris.
No, comprehensive, Neil, as ever. Thank you for that. So thanks everyone for the first part of the presentation. The time is 10:29, so we are prompt and on time. We're going to have a 10-minute break now, so we could come back at 10:40. And Anthony Fox will then be looking at giving an employment law update. So he'll be looking at some hot topics in employment law, things on the horizon in terms of legislation, and then a summary of the key case law that we've had in the last 12 months. And then we'll hear again from Neil in relation to a health and safety update. So we'll see everyone in 10 minutes time, 10:40. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Yes, so it's 10:40, so we're aiming to finish at 11:30. So we have Anthony and then Neil on health and safety, but I'll hand over to Anthony for the employment law update. Anthony.
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody. I don't know about everybody else, but my favourite part so far is imagining people doing VR training and walking into each other in the training room. I can see that happening completely. I'd also like to see some footage of Chris playing virtual reality cricket in his front room and tripping over his sofa. That'd be great. Please, Chris, if you could work that out for me.
I'll send you a video if I can.
Thanks. All right. So I'm going to talk about current hot topics, what's on the horizon, and I'm going to give you a case update about what's kind of been going on in the world of employment law for the past 12 months-ish. Current hot topics. At the minute, there's only a few major hot topics that you can talk about, and both of the things that I'm going to talk about fall into the category of either inflation or financial management. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is about side hustles. Now, side hustles, how does that link to inflation and financial management? Well, side hustles have been around for a while. And the idea behind side hustles is that people who have a particular job need more money for whatever reason, therefore pick up a second job. Now, according to new research from Aviva, 1 in 5 adults has started a side hustle since 2020. During the COVID pandemic, when everybody was sent home, a lot of people weren't paid. People needed more money to pay for things and to survive generally. Everybody picked up a second job, not unexpected. They've also been around before that. They weren't such a hot topic at that point, but side hustles are generally suggested to people in terms of financial independence and how to get there. And the idea is that if you can't make more money in your current job, then you get a side hustle, you get more income, and you get financial independence that way. So people will be looking at this from, we need to get more money from another job to pay for something. And the other side of things is we need to get more money to invest it or whatever you want to do with it to get some financial independence another way. So what is a side hustle? It's a great way for people to earn extra income by getting a second job, basically. And it can be anything. Anything can be a side hustle. You could be driving an Uber, you could be working at Tesco, you could be doing anything. You could be making videos on YouTube. These would all be side hustles. And the first thing to think about, really, from an employer's point of view, is what can we do to prevent people from taking up side hustles? Now, I'm not really a fan of the idea of preventing people from doing stuff, which really makes an awful lot of sense. But I can see an employer's point of view here where it might be a bit of an issue. So what can we do to stop people? Well, a lot of employers have clauses in their employment contracts that limit what employees can do outside of work, so their outside interests. And if those outside interests conflict in any way with the employment that they do full time or on a day-to-day basis, if there's a conflict there, then they're prevented from having any outside interests or doing a second job. A lot of employers will just blanket ban second jobs and say you can't do them. Some employers will require the employee to tell the employer what they're doing and say, look, this is what I want to do. Is that okay? And if the employer okays it, fine, they can carry on. If the employer doesn't okay it for whatever reason, then they can't. And if they do get the second job, which whether it's in conflict or not with their normal employment, it would technically be a breach of contract. You might also be able to put a limit on what kind of industries people can work in or what kind of jobs people can do outside of work. So this is ways that employers can kind of keep a lid on people doing too much or too many side hustles that might conflict. You don't want somebody working, for example, for you, and then part-time at the weekend they're also working for a competitor doing the same thing. That would be ridiculous. So that's kind of what the outside interest clauses are trying to stop. But without good reason, I couldn't see a reason why you'd need to stop employees doing whatever they want outside of work unless it affects your business as an employer. Now, you might also want to consider if an employee is doing a second job when they're not working for you. Let's say they work for you 40 hours a week and they're doing 20 hours a week of a different job. Does that mean that they get enough rest when they turn up for your job on a Monday morning? Are they going to be exhausted? Are they going to be underperforming as a result? So these are the kind of things you want to think about. Should we prevent employees from undertaking side hustles? As I mentioned earlier, my view on that is we shouldn't just prevent them unless there's a reason to do it. It's generally advisable to consider allowing them to take up side hustles unless there's some kind of conflict of interest there, or if it's going to make people too tired to come to work and actually do their job properly. That would obviously be a problem. But at the minute, a lot of industries are finding it difficult to attract and keep employees for any period of time. And if you don't offer the ability for them to get another job outside of work, they may just not be interested for that reason. They might want to take up a side hustle of some kind. And if you prevent it from the get-go, then you might not even get them to work for you in the first place. In current financial circumstances, employees might need to find a side hustle to just make ends meet. Like I mentioned earlier, this is one of the reasons why people do it. And if an employee undertakes a side hustle that's related to their hobby or some kind of mental well-being for some other reason, then it could be beneficial to their mental health, and you stopping them from doing that side hustle might be detrimental to their mental health, and obviously that wouldn't be ideal. If we can keep their mental health as high as possible, that will make them more productive in the role that they do for their full-time employer. So what do we need to be aware of if we allow employees to undertake side hustles? Now, the main thing here is the issue of the working time regulations. Now, you may have seen in various employment contracts that there's an opt-out of the working time regulations. And there's also usually a clause in employment contracts that says that if employees have second jobs, they need to tell us, well, why is usually the question, why do we need to know what they're doing, and why is it relevant? Well, it's relevant to the working time regulations, because if somebody's working more than 48 hours a week and we don't know about it, then we need to do something about that, because they can't work 48 hours a week without opting out of that regulation. So it could cause issues. So it's usually helpful for employers to find out whether their employees are working extra outside of their normal working hours. And if they are working more than 48 hours a week, put steps in place to maybe get them to opt out of the 48-hour limit, or put steps in place to make sure that their mental health isn't struggling or their physical health isn't struggling, and see if there's anything you can do to help there. What should we do if we don't have an outside interest clause in our contracts of employment? Well, if you don't have one, there's not an awful lot that you can do about it without one. There's no real way to limit side hustles and people getting second jobs if you don't have an outside interest clause. If you wanted to introduce one, you'd have to consult with the staff and agree to that clause being added. Now, there's nothing to stop you from talking to staff and asking them if they have a second job, just to see where they're up to. But there's without an outside interest clause, we can't be limiting what they can and can't do outside of work. You can ask them, but they wouldn't be in breach of any contracts if they were to just crack on regardless and do that job. All right, so the second issue that I'm going to talk about, the second hot topic, also linked to inflation and financial management, is winter blackouts. All right, so why is that related to inflation? Well, the fact that energy prices have shot up in the last 12 months, 18 months, has added to the reason for inflation going up to about 11%. You can blame whatever you want on inflation. I suppose it's partly to do with the war. It's partly to do with the fact that millions and millions and millions of pounds of money was printed during COVID. You can blame it on lots of things. One of the things is high energy prices. So winter blackouts, the high energy price situation and the limit on how much energy we can apparently get at the minute from Russia caused by the war, means that we may not have enough energy, or we can't afford enough energy to pay for constant electricity and gas during the winter when it gets particularly cold. So there's been an idea that there will be winter blackouts, actual blackouts, where the government would introduce a rota of, say, a 3-hour block during the day or during a week, where certain areas of the country would have their power turned off for 3 hours. It would happen in different areas at different times, and people would be affected whatever the time is. It might happen during the day, it might happen in the middle of the night. Probably wouldn't happen in the middle of the night because that wouldn't really save anybody anything. But similar things have happened in South Africa for a long time. South Africa really struggles with producing enough energy for what it needs, and they've been having these shutdowns quite often for about 10 years now, I think. So it's not something that's never happened before, and it's not something that can't happen. They just turn the power off, and then you have to deal with whatever comes from it. But what does this mean for a business? Well, it's expected that certain businesses will be able to apply for protected site status. So certain designated services, if you meet the criteria set out in the government's electricity supply emergency code, such as airports, shipping ports, railways, oil refineries, food manufacturing, they would generally be accepted and wouldn't have their power turned off. And it's recognised that if businesses are not protected, any planned cut-offs could cause them to suffer huge financial losses. And planned outages are a step of last resort rather than the first thing they'll come to. So it is a problem. And if you're not a protected business, you may just have to deal with the fact that the electric is going to go off at some point if they introduce these. What can employees do? So there are some practical steps businesses can take to stay operational during any planned cut-offs. Number one is, well, the main thing is have a plan in place, good plan. The plan is to have a plan. It's always better to be prepared as possible, as much as possible, and it's advisable for businesses to have a plan in place to cover if there are any unplanned outages. From a health and safety perspective, employers could complete a risk assessment to allow workers to remain on site in case of a shutdown, and what steps need to be taken if there is some kind of accident. Not the best advice. Have a plan and just deal with the electrics being turned off and just carry on if you can, regardless. It's not particularly helpful. But the good thing is with this, I say good thing, is that it hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet because it seems the winter in Europe has been a lot warmer than people thought it would be. There hasn't been so much of a run on the electricity grids, if I'll put it like that. A run on the electricity grids. Nobody's demanded lots and lots of electric at 7 o'clock in the evening when Coronation Street goes for a break. So it's been warmer than expected, which means that we don't have to heat warm houses up quite as much. So there is enough electricity and gas left over. So we might even get through this winter without having any planned outages. And I'm sure if there are planned outages and that's actually introduced, then the government will introduce some kind of plan on what the rota is and how it's going to work. But it hasn't happened yet. Will it happen? We're coming to the end of winter. It might not happen this year. It might not happen. So fingers crossed. Now, one of the ideas that you could think about is reorganizing work around planned outages. So could we adjust usual business hours to have a break when the 3-hour outage is on and reopen when the outage turns back off again? When the electric comes back on, you open the business, and when the electric goes back off, you close the business. Use of annual leave. So during periods of outages, could we get employees to use annual leave? I mean, they have annual leave and they can use it whenever they want to, but equally employers, if they need to, can make employers go on annual leave given the right amount of notice. Twice the length of notice as the period of leave that you want to give somebody. It's FYI. So if you want someone to have a week's notice, you need to give them a week's holiday. You need to give them 2 weeks notice of that holiday, and then they can go on holiday. So that's an idea, getting people to take holiday in case if there is any kind of shutdown. Now, reports suggest that the National Grid will aim to inform the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy by 2 p.m. the day before any restrictions. So there should be some time, although not an awful lot of notice if anything happens like this. Layoffs and short-time working is also an option. I'm sure that everybody has also asked at some point, why have we got a layoff clause in our contract? This became quite apparent when COVID happened, when COVID struck, and everybody had layoff clauses, and they were like, all right, let's lay people off and not have to pay them. And then people without layoff clauses were like, oh, no, we don't have layoff clauses, so we can't lay them off. We're going to have to just make them redundant or keep them. So that's why layoff clauses are important in case of an emergency like this. Now, if you have a situation where you've got power grid shutdowns for 3 hours, you might want to consider short-time working and or layoffs for certain staff. in which case you could reduce pay accordingly. Again, as long as you've got a layoff clause in the contract. But given that there's supposed to be a short duration, 3 hours isn't really a period of time to lay people off. It might not be particularly practical for most businesses, if we're perfectly honest. Home working, this is all very relevant to the post-COVID world with our layoff clauses, high inflation, and home working. Everybody loves a bit of home working. A lot of businesses don't like home working. I accept that. Most employees like home working. They will request home working left, right, and centre. Most employees now think they have a right to work at home. So home working is an idea. So you could consider introducing, or if you've used home working before, allow people to work at home a little bit more. If you don't have a home working policy, consider introducing one to cover this kind of incident. Could it be limited to just the power outages? Yeah, it could be. You could let them work at home just generally as part of an everyday week, everyday week, a usual week. But you could just say that it's limited to whenever there's a planned power outage, and they might just not get a lot of notice, but we'll tell you the night before if you need to come into the office or not. There's an idea. It might also help with, there's a cost of living crisis. It might also help with people's travel costs. That's beneficial. I'll take that. Communication. So like most of these things, people don't like change, and people don't like being thrown into a deep end of any kind. And turning the power off for 3 hours a day or a week or whenever it is going to cause people to get a bit panicky. So communication is key. Power disrupts employees at work and at home, and it affects people's performance at work, obviously. Good communication is paramount, and you need to put the detailed plan in place as soon as you can. It would be helpful if you can to liaise with councils, employee forums, or smaller organisations, or directly with staff if you don't have any kind of employee forum or general staff representatives. But you'd need to let your staff know essentially what the plan is going to be and how you'll approach it, and that should be able to guide and support staff with their overall well-being. So there you go. That's how to manage winter blackouts. Should the winter blackouts happen between now and the end of February, you've got about 5 or 6 weeks left before like major winter ends, and then it's time for spring, and we can probably stop talking about having winter blackouts because it's spring blackouts after that. Is that a thing? I don't know if that's a thing. We'll have to see if spring blackouts are something that they introduce in spring. So there you go, bit of waffle about inflation and stuff. So now I'm going to talk about what's on the horizon for the next year, probably the next year. Harking back to, remember everybody, we left the European Union and Brexit happened. What will happen to EU law this year? Well, when we left the EU, most of the EU law that we had was retained to make sure that people didn't go crazy. An agreement was signed on the 30th of December 2020 to confirm that the UK could modify certain laws if it wanted to. And if this retained EU law bill is passed, all EU law will expire at the end of December this year. So when all EU law expires at the end of December of this year, and if we haven't introduced some kind of domestic version of these laws, then they will essentially just disappear. Now, I'm sure the government's all over this. I'm sure they're all over it. Absolutely. They're 110% behind this. And it won't be a situation where 3 weeks before the end of the year, there's panic and bills being put through Parliament left, right and centre to make sure that we don't lose, for example, the working time regulations and TUPE regulations and part-time workers regulations, all these different types of regulations that have come from EU law, which we don't have domestic versions of yet. Technically, the working time regulations is UK law. It's the working time directive that is EU law, but they'll still have implications there. So if the bill isn't passed, or if all the EU law does expire at the end of the year, then things like part-time workers protection, fixed-term employee protection, agency workers regulations, collective redundancy consultations, rights to family-friendly leave and pay, even that is affected by EU law, and some aspects of discrimination. such as religion and sexual orientation. The Equality Act came from EU law, and while the Equality Act from 2010 is a UK piece of legislation, again, this will still have an impact if they don't sort things out. So I imagine that by the end of the year that this will all be dealt with and we won't have to panic. So don't panic. And if necessary for that, the government can extend it until June 2026. So I wouldn't be surprised if it gets extended until June 2026, and then they've got an extra 3 years, and the next parliament can sort that out. There you go. That's my take. I think they're just going to push it down the line. But who am I? I don't know anything. I just have opinions on things. Next up, additional family-friendly rights. Additional family-friendly rights. So there are 4 bills currently progressing through Parliament, which, if approved, will lead to people having some additional family-friendly rights to add to their current family-friendly rights, or to change current family-friendly rights. So the first one is neonatal care. So the bill is currently in its earliest stages and the process of passing through Parliament. The bill seeks to make it a legal requirement for employers to allow employees to take time off from work for appointments for fertility treatment or connected purposes, like you would take time off for things like pregnancy-related appointments. Given the length of time it will take for the bill to pass, receive royal assent and be passed through law, it's not expected to be law for some time. So we're not even looking at 2023, I imagine. But the bill is due to have its report stage and third reading in February 2023. Which, could it happen this year? It might do. Will it happen this year? I don't know. It might be next year. Next one is carers leave. So the government has confirmed also that it has support for a carers leave bill, which, if passed, will allow employers to take up to a week's leave each year to provide or arrange care for a dependent with long-term care need. It's expected the new right will come into force 2024. Details of it aren't clear yet. We don't know how it's going to work. If and when it does come in, there'll be an update from everybody who advises on employment HR, and we'll have an update as well. There'll be updates everywhere about how it works, who it applies to, what it means. Details aren't clear yet, so they don't really know how it works or what it means or what it does or anything like that. There's just a bill, so that will come in, carers leave for a week a year, and just keep an eye out. Not yet, but in the future. Remember, this is the on the horizon section, so we're in the future. Redundancy protection specifically for people who've been on maternity leave or equivalents. So the current position is that parents who are at risk of redundancy while on maternity, adoption, or shared parental leave have additional protection against being made redundant. If you've ever made redundancies, you'll know this. You can't make a person who's on maternity leave redundant quite so easily as you would be able to if they were not on maternity leave. They just get any suitable alternative vacancies that you have. They get given them. They don't have to apply for them or win them or anything. They get given them. They get lots of treatment during maternity. So the Redundancy, Pregnancy and Family Leave Bill will give the Secretary of State power to extend the circumstances under which an employer must offer suitable alternative employment. So the idea here is that the additional rights will like this: women at risk of redundancy, once they've told their employer that they're pregnant, including following a miscarriage, and parents who've taken maternity, adoption, or shared parental leave, if they're at risk of redundancy within 18 months of a child's birth or adoption, they will have additional rights in theory. Like you can't be made redundant so easily while you're on maternity leave, there'll be a period of time after somebody comes back from maternity leave when they're also protected from being made redundant for, say, 6 months. After, you still can't make them redundant. You still have to treat them like they're on maternity leave. They get any suitable alternative vacancies that there are. They don't have to apply for them, etc. The rights are extended for a longer period. There you go. So we don't know yet when the regulations come into force, but the bill committee meets on the 3rd of February. The 3rd of February, there's a meeting happening and lots of bills are being talked about. When's this going to come in? I don't know. Is it going to be this year? I don't know. Maybe next year. 2024. I'm going to bet 2024 that this is when this is going to happen. Finally, flexible working. Now, everybody loves a bit of flexible working. Tell me you don't love flexible working. I love flexible working. All of our clients' employees love flexible working. A lot of our clients don't think flexible working is the best thing ever, but employees love flexible working. So the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy has published its response to the consultation on making flexible working the default. Imagine flexible working being a default right for everybody to have, which is likely to affect the current law on flexible working requests in due course. And these are the changes. The right to request flexible working is a day one right instead of having to be in your employment for 26 weeks. You can ask for it on day one. Government has maintained specific emphasis in its response that it remains a right to request and not an automatic right to have. So you can ask for flexible working from day one. Doesn't mean you are entitled to have flexible working at all, even from day one. The second one, employees will be permitted to make 2 requests within a 12-month period instead of the 1 request now. So they get an extra 100% of requests to make during the 12 months. If one fails, they can make another one within 12 months. The response time for employers to respond to flexible working requests will reduce from 3 months to 2 months. It's not like they're making it hard, is it? So 3 months to 2 months, you have to deal with them quicker, 1 month quicker, 30% quicker is what we have to be. A new duty will be imposed on employers to discuss alternative forms of flexible working that are available if an employer intends to reject the request. So you need to come up with some alternatives. Now, I suggest already that if somebody's made a flexible working request, we don't just say, no, see you later. We come up with some kind of proposal, some sort of midway point where we can be happy and they can be happy and everyone's happy-ish. No one's perfectly happy because no one's getting what they want, but everyone's happy enough that they can carry on with their lives and crack on with things. We need to now, well, the idea is that we have a duty to provide alternative options for these employees, which is fine. We can do that. There's no indication as to whether that will be a statutory requirement or just guidance. So it might be guidance. It might be forced upon everybody. It might not. The current list of 8 reasons by which employees can refuse a request will remain the same. So there's a list of reasons whereby you can say it's being rejected for this reason, and there's 8 of them. If you've dealt with a flexible working request, you'll know about these, but they're not changing, they're staying the same. So if we can't accommodate a request because of difficulties in rearranging work or not having the staff to cover it, that kind of thing, they're all the same. On the 21st of October 2022, the government announced that it would support the bill for third-party sexual harassment. So we're going to talk about third-party sexual harassment next. Historically, there was a right in the Employment Act, the Equality Act, which prevented third-party harassment. It was removed for why? I don't know why it was removed, but if people were harassed by third parties, say customers in a shop, you had the right, you have the obligation as an employer to prevent that or put steps in place to prevent that. And if you didn't, it was discrimination on the basis of third-party harassment, sexual harassment. It got removed. Why did it get removed? I don't know. But they're now introducing a bill to reintroduce some form of third-party sexual harassment, which is a good thing. I'll give them that. This is a good thing. It will create a liability for employers if there is third-party harassment going on, and introduce a duty on employers to want to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment of their employees. Great. And there'll be compensation if somebody brings a claim. An uplift, like the kind of uplift you get for failing to follow the ACAS code of practice. This would be a compensation uplift, not exceeding 25% in sexual harassment cases where there's been a breach of this duty. And there's no requirement for there to be 2 or more independents before an employer can be held liable. This was from the old laws, before they took down the old laws and replaced them with no laws until now. There was a requirement for there to be 2 or more incidents. If there was 1 incident, that wasn't enough. 2 incidents or more than 2, and you were then held liable. Because there's lots of research saying that 40% of women experience sexual harassment during the course of their career, and it's not something that you want to deal with really. But there you go. We're going to have a bill about introducing third-party harassment. Okay. That is the update on things that will happen in the future and haven't happened yet, and also what's happening with inflation and stuff like that. So what we're going to go on to now is talk about some key cases, quick overview of key cases, because I'm quite aware that I've blabbed on a lot for this first bit and I'm way over time, so I apologize, but let's just go anyway. First case is Harper Trust and Brazel. Now, if you haven't heard of this, you've been sat in a box for a while, but essentially this is about calculating holiday pay. So there was a case, Harper Trust and Brazel, which has been through the courts, and the employee here was paid holiday pay based on the calculation of 12.07% of her hours. She was a worker who worked at school, and she worked during term time only. She didn't work outside of term time, just worked in term time. And the idea behind this is that she claimed that she was paid incorrectly for her holiday, because the working time regulations say that you are entitled to 5.6 weeks of holiday a year. And the 12.07% of her hours wasn't giving her 5.6 weeks of holiday in a year. So she claimed that she was being underpaid. And the outcome, essentially, do I need to go through all the facts? I don't need to go through all the facts, because the facts are what they are. She brought a holiday pay claim. She thought she was underpaid. And do the circumstances matter? The circumstances matter in that it applies to some employees and doesn't apply to some other employees. It applies to employees, really, who work part of the year and not the full year. So if you have people working, in this case, for schools during term time only, where you have periods of the year where terms end and it's the end of term bit, summer holidays, Easter holidays, those types of periods of time where people don't work, those are part year workers, and those are the people that this impacts. So which employees are impacted? Part year workers, shift workers, generally those who work part year, and casual or 0 hours employees or workers, also where they kind of work part year. It's people who work part year. So if you've got part-time people who work, say, 3 days a week, except that they work 3 days every week all year, then they're not really part year workers. It doesn't really apply to them. It doesn't work in the same way. If workers don't receive 5.6 weeks of holiday in their holiday entitlement, then there's a risk of an unlawful deduction of wages claim in an employment tribunal. So just make sure that if we have employees and if they're working part of the year and they're not working in certain parts of the year, then they get 5.6 weeks of holiday. Now, that might leave you in a situation where people who work only part of the year, so they work, say, 9 months out of the year and 3 months are summer holidays, they get more holidays pro rata than full-time workers. That's probably going to happen. If that happens, that is unfortunately just the way that it is. And that's that. They're going to have more holidays pro rata. So there's a consultation going through at the minute by the government because the outcome of the case means that some part-time workers will be having more holidays than full-time workers who work the same hours across the year. So they've launched a consultation seeking views on this. Seeking views. They're just asking questions. How do we deal with this? The consultation closes in March, so we won't find any more information about this until March. But in March, there'll be some kind of an update. That's holiday pay. Next is this case of Kong and Gulf International Bank. Is an employee's dismissal always fair, where the reason for dismissal is that they've made a protected disclosure? In this case, the claimant, the employee here, made a complaint to her supervisor that it was inappropriate to use an industry standard financial compliance template for non-bank-to-bank lending, as it was designed for bank-to-bank lending. Now, if you're not in the banking industry, like I'm not, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to me either. However, that's what the complaint was about. It wasn't the complaint that mattered. What happened was the person that she told this complaint to felt that she was being undermined. She felt upset by the way that it was raised. She felt that she was trying to criticize her personal integrity, and because of that she was disciplined and dismissed, because that conduct, the way that she raised the protected disclosure, was poor behavior, bad conduct, bad misconduct, bad. She was dismissed. Was she dismissed because she raised a protected disclosure? No, she was dismissed because of the manner in which she raised a protected disclosure. That's the point here. So just because you raise a protected disclosure and then you're dismissed, if the protected disclosure itself isn't the reason for being dismissed, the way you raise the protected disclosure, that still is technically okay. It will be fact dependent, obviously. It won't always be the same case in every case, but that's what the judge decided here. Very nice. Right. Next one we're going to have a look at is Redundancy selection. We're going to look at redundancy selection. Yes, I had another claim between this one and the last one, but I've skipped that one because it's about COT3 agreements and it's about protecting future claims. The shorthand of the case that I've just skipped is if you've got a COT3 agreement to settle an employment tribunal claim and the clause is wide enough to protect any future claims, it will cover any future claims. That's the shorthand. So redundancy, anyway, let's be honest with redundancy. Because like I say, I am late. So Morgan and Bradford Teaching Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust has determined that it's unfair for an employer making redundancies to decide on a pool of one without prior consultation. Well, that's terrible. What did they find here? Whilst a pool of one can be fair and appropriate, it should not be considered without prior consultation where there is more than one employee in the pool. So ordinarily, when you're going through redundancy consultation, if you have more than one employee, you need to consult with them, you need to score them, you need to deal with the outcome of the scores. You select the person who scored the lowest to be made redundant. That's usually how that goes. But in this situation, this was a pool of one person and there was no prior consultation. Now, even if there's a pool of one person, there should still be consultation because you're still making them redundant. You don't have to go through the whole palaver of selection criteria and scoring people, but you still need to make sure you consult with them. It remains a position that in situations where there's not more than one employee carrying out the role, there's no need to consult with the employee in relation to a pool. You're not consulting with them in relation to a pool. You don't have to do that, but you don't have to consult with them about the redundancy. It's important for employers to genuinely apply their minds to the relevant pool. You still have to consider yourselves whether you should be putting this employee into a pool or not. You have to identify the correct pool. If the pool is of one, that's fine, but you need to show that you've put effort into identifying what the pool is. Ensure the decision is within the range of reasonable responses and consult with employees on an appropriate pool where the matter is not clear. So automatically, you don't have to consult on a pool. But if you're not sure, if you don't know, if you've got lots of people who do very similar roles and you can't really tell one from the other, you might have to consult with them on the correct pool. But ordinarily, you don't have to consult with them on the correct pool, whether there's a pool of one. Just make sure that you address the question of what the pool is and who the pool is supposed to be. That would be fair and that would be fine. Next one. This is my last one. You'll be very sad to hear this is my last case, and then I'm going to vanish from your screens for the next 12 months, and then I might be back next January. So the last one is called vanishing dismissals. I like this one. Marangakis. There's always one where I struggle with the claimant's name. Marangakis and Iceland Food Limited. Does a dismissal vanish when somebody appeals successfully against their dismissal? In short, yes, it does. If somebody appeals against the dismissal, this is what happened here. It was very straightforward, really. She decided that she was going to bring a claim and say that she was dismissed. She was dismissed for whatever the reason she was dismissed for. The reason she was dismissed doesn't really matter here. What happened is she appealed and the appeal was successful. After appeal was successful, she was because she was dismissed because she failed to attend work. She brought an unfair dismissal claim. The appeal was successful, remember, so she still brought an unfair dismissal claim, but the appeal was successful. The employment tribunal considered it had no jurisdiction to hear the claim because the dismissal had vanished because she appealed against the dismissal and had been reinstated. So there was no dismissal because she'd been reinstated. Just because she didn't turn up, that's her own fault. The Employment Appeal Tribunal rejected the appeal. It was common ground that if an appeal against a dismissal is successful, the parties are bound to treat the dismissal as not having occurred. There you go. Irrespective of the employee's subjective wishes. Doesn't matter what the employee wants. She appeals and is successful. She's an employee again, and that's it. She's got to work. If an appeal is withdrawn, then this outcome could be avoided. She could appeal, and then before the outcome, she withdraws it, and then she's good to go because there's no appeal, so she's been dismissed. This is a useful reminder to employers that if an appeal is successful and an employee is reinstated, they cannot bring an unfair dismissal claim in relation to the original dismissal because there was no dismissal. It disappears, it vanishes, vanishing dismissals, it disappears forever. That's it, there's no dismissal. This may be something an employer can actually use tactically if, following appeal, it's concerned about a successful claim for unfair dismissal and does not believe that an employee will wish to return to work. There you go. So if there's an appeal and they win the appeal, the dismissal vanishes and they are no longer dismissed. That's it. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass over to, I believe, Christopher Boyle, who may have some questions for me.
I don't actually have any questions, but thank you very much, Anthony. I'm exhausted after that. Yes, perversely, you do get employees wanting to be dismissed, and that's always an interesting conundrum. So good clarity there from the tribunal. Okay, the time is 19 minutes past 11. So I'm going to hand over to Neil now for a health and safety update to finish us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Hello again. So I'm not going to take as long as Anthony, probably only 5 or 10 minutes for my section. So I'm just going to highlight to you the health and safety executive statistics that were published on the 23rd of November last year. So if I could have the next slide, please, and the one after. So the statistics for the 2021-2022 period, they were published 23rd of November. The front page of those statistics highlights this next bullet point there. So an estimated 900,000 cases of work-related stress, depression or anxiety in 2021-2022. So that's one of their key statistics that they're highlighting. And that resulted in 17 million working days lost. So a significant amount of time that was lost. To put that into perspective, against previous years, that's an increase of roughly 14%. Okay, so it has gone up from previous years. And overall, there were 36.8 million working days that were lost due to work-related ill health and non-fatal workplace injuries. So if we go on to the next slide, this is the infographic that the Health and Safety Executive have provided. So 123 fatalities in work-related accidents in 2021-22. Roughly 500,000 workers sustained a non-fatal injury. 61,500 employees suffered non-fatal injuries that were reportable under RIDDOR. So don't forget that RIDDOR is specified injuries that need reporting. And 6 million working days lost due to those non-fatal workplace injuries. So you can see that any injury can result in working days that are lost, which may reduce production, put stress on your other employees to cover the work for them, etc., etc. The next slide looks at these fatal work-related accidents and highlights the industry sectors that they occurred in. These sectors tend not to change year on year. So we get construction at the top, we get agriculture, forestry and fishing, and then manufacturing. And these industry sectors have been consistent for the last 5 or 6 years, so there's been no change in them. But it's just to highlight the sectors where work-related fatalities have happened. The next slide looks at the types of accident that occurred for that fatal accident to happen. And similar to the previous slide, again, these haven't changed much year on year. The falls at height, still most common cause of workplace fatality, followed by being struck by a moving vehicle, followed being struck by a moving object, etc., etc. All these statistics are available on the HSE website. You can download them as a PDF if you did want to dive into what's after the top 5, so to speak. The next slide looks at the non-fatal injuries by the accident type. So we're looking at slips, trips and falls as the most common cause of non-fatal injury, followed by what we would typically call manual handling operations, followed being struck by an object. Acts of violence has now crept up into the top 5, and falls from height is the last one in the top 5. So you can see the rough percentages there. So slips, trips and falls accounting for 1/3 of all non-fatal injuries to employees in the workplace. You'll be pleased to know the next slide is my last slide. And again, it's just looking at these non-fatal workplace injuries and seeing which industry sector they occur in. So similar to the fatalities, we've got construction, agriculture, forestry and fishing near to the top. But then creeping in, we've got accommodation and food services in 3rd, transportation, wholesale, and you can see the list going down. It was purely just to highlight where these non-fatal workplace injuries are occurring and what industry sectors they are occurring in. So as I say, short and sweet, my update. If there is no questions, I'm going to hand back to Chris Boyle.
Thanks, Neil. Okay, I don't think we have any questions from the audience, and I don't have any further questions. So the time is approaching 11:30, which is good. So I think I just want to thank everyone for attending today. We will be sending out the recording on email with some other information. So you'll get that on email, if not today, then tomorrow. We have some other events coming up in the future for clients and Q&A sessions. We do those every month now. So again, we'll keep you updated with those. But I'd just like to thank the attendees, Helena, Chris, Anthony, Neil. Have I missed anyone out there? No. Thanks to you all for the presentation and preparation. Thanks for everyone attending, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you. See you all soon.